Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing, and thank all the panelists. I'd like to ask Mr. Argaiati, I'd like to ask you about the additional leverage that the BDC bill would allow. Of course, we're still talking about very low levels of leverage. The bill would only increase the maximum leverage ratio from 1-to-1 to 2-to-1, but it's still a higher leverage. What would your company do with the higher leverage that this bill would permit?
Sure. So I think as Mr. Gerber said in his testimony, it is not abundantly clear that every company will actually take advantage of the incremental asset coverage ratio. I think one of the wonderful things about the BDC industry is that it services all types of companies, from venture finance companies all the way through to larger middle market companies. And even on this panel, you have companies who focus on the lower middle market with a more equity orientation, through to folks like ourselves who focus more on larger market senior secured loans. So what Ares would likely do would be to increase the scope of its lending activities, probably become more senior secured and therefore less risky in our investment positioning, and use the incremental leverage, back to Mr. Gerber's commentary, to drive the same if not higher returns to our investors, but taking less risk at the asset level.
So how much of the additional money would go to increase investments in the so-called 70% bucket for small businesses? It would give you more money to, more liquidity to put out to these smaller businesses.
Right. So all of that capital should theoretically find its way to small business. So maybe addressing, at least for Ares, the 30% basket as we use it has two concentrated positions in it today. One is called the Senior Secured Loan Program, which is a joint venture that we had with GE Capital that we use to actually make middle market loans. And the second is in the form of a company that we call Ivy Hill Asset Management, which similarly is in the business of making middle market loans. So at least from the Ares strategic perspective, we've been using our quote-unquote 30% basket to in fact make middle market loans to small companies.
I'd like to ask you and also Mr. Foster about the discussion draft of the BDC bill, which would allow BDCs to invest more of their assets in finance companies. And as Mr. Foster testified, the intent of the first BDC bills was to direct these monies towards goods and services that are really underfinanced and need this help. Are you concerned that this change could change how BDCs are viewed by investors and analysts? And what's your feeling about being able to invest more in finance companies as opposed to goods and services? And I'd like first to hear from Mr. Foster and Mr. Argaiati, but also any comments from anybody else on the panel on this question of allowing the finance companies.
Sure. Well, the BDCs in the SBIA have generally been polled by the staff, and in general, there's a consensus with respect to the BDCs, the 34 BDCs in the SBIA, not 100%, but a general consensus, is that this additional flexibility, would be nice. It's not a priority at all, and I don't think many of us would take advantage of it. We personally would not take advantage of it. I think you would do so at your own risk, to the degree you alienated some of your shareholders or what have you by changing your business plan. On the other hand, we're permanent vehicles for capital, and there's a constantly changing array of investment opportunities out there, and the credit cycle goes up and down. So to me, it's kind of like the swimming pool in the backyard. I really don't use it, but it's nice to, it's nice to know it's there if I ever want to use it, and I think that's the general consensus of the SBIA.
Mr. Argaiati?
Yeah, I think about this two ways. One, just in the context of modernization, and as we sit here today talking about legislation that was passed 35 years ago, while many things are still similar in terms of the capital void for middle market companies, the structure of the financial markets has changed. And things like small ticket leasing, things like factoring, things like receivables financing, all exist today in a way that they didn't exist 30 years ago. So as one example in our portfolio, we have a leasing company that makes office equipment leases to small business.
Okay. My time is almost expired, and I'd like to hear Mr. Foster's reaction to it, too. I only have 7 minutes left. Mr. Brown's Mr. Brown's up.
You know, my biggest concern is that there will be funds redirected away from operating companies and to these financial firms. I don't know if financial firms need the funds in the same way that operating companies do, but there's a defined need here for operating companies. And I think before the legislation allows for the redirecting of funds away from those companies, it should have a stronger empirical basis for determining that that's a more appropriate use of funds.
Thank you.